Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. I'm Lauren Laidlaw. I head up sales and marketing here at Safety Partners, and we are thrilled that you are joining us today for this Q&A. Jennifer Riley, our President and Chief Operating Officer, will be moderating today, and our resident expert who will be answering your questions is Kristin Garland. She's our Associate Director of Industrial Hygiene and Quality Research and Training. Kristin's been a member of our team for over 17 years, and she leads all of Safety Partners' industrial hygiene work. She's going to lead us off today with a short summary of her recent blog, and then we'll jump right into your questions. Just wanted to take a minute to remind everybody that the information provided today does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice or medical advice, that all information today is for general purposes only, and that the information on this webinar is up to date as of today and may not constitute the most up-to-date information after today, April 30th, 2020. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the content of this webinar are hereby expressly disclaimed. And none of the Safety Partner staff in any way whatsoever can be responsible for use of this information as discussed here in the webinar. So with that, please get your questions ready and put them into the queue by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Kristin to start off with a quick summary of her recent blog.
Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. I wrote a blog a couple weeks ago about mask usage, and I'm just going to give a quick summary now. There's 3 different types of masks that people have been using kind of out and about. The first is an N95 mask. This is not an actual N95 mask, but it was the closest I could find. These are typically NIOSH approved and do protect the wearer from any material in the environment. Currently, these are being reserved for healthcare workers, and we would encourage the donation if you have any. Second are surgical type masks. These are also used by healthcare workers, and these are meant to protect the environment around the wearer versus protecting the wearer themselves. Again, these are also recommended right now for healthcare workers. And last but not least, we have all of the crafters pitching in and making homemade cloth masks. These are recommended currently by the CDC, and some kind of face covering is required in certain municipalities at this time when you're out in public. Again, these do not necessarily protect the wearer from virus in the environment or anything in the environment, but it does a good job of helping to contain any aerosols that may be emitted by the wearer. So these are used to protect people around you. So that is a quick overview of the different types of masks. And I think we should open it up to questions.
Oh, great, Kristin. Thank you for that overview, and thank you for writing that blog. I think if you haven't seen it, you can go to the Safety Partners website and see the full blog. So first, yeah, let's take this time to be able to answer questions from all the attendees. So we have several questions that have come in. So when we get started, one of the questions that's come in is, should employees be wearing their masks when they're sitting at their desks in an open cube area in their office space?
So current guidance is that anytime you're in a public space, you should be wearing some kind of face covering. So that would include when you're sitting in an office cubicle area. In addition, as I mentioned, there are a few municipalities that have ordinances on the books right now, such as Cambridge, that are requiring the use of some kind of cloth covering when you're in any public space, and your office cubicle area would be covered under that regulation.
So, people our clients and companies are going out there to go and purchase masks. And what are the standards that people should look for, differences in international standards versus the same as the United States?
So current guidance has changed somewhat because of the issues with the supply chain. Generally speaking, to appropriately use an N95 respirator in the US, it has to be specifically NIOSH approved. So that's for an occupational use. Currently, that guideline's been relaxed somewhat to allow use of masks that have an equivalent certification from another country, such as from Mexico or from the EU or from other areas of the world. Those masks are being allowed to be used in an occupational setting as well. This obviously is huge for healthcare workers because they are really in dire need of proper PPE, especially N95s currently. So for them, those regulations are in place. For other occupational areas, the rules have generally been relaxed as well in terms of fit testing, being able to use masks past their expiration date, and being able to use masks from other countries as well.
So, you touched upon supply chain issues and shortage of masks, and people are seeing in the workplace now, they might be, being asked to hold on to their mask for consecutive days, or when it feels wet or worn out. And, is this safe practice? And what, advice would you give in regards to how long you can use a mask and reuse a mask?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it somewhat depends. If you are using a cloth face covering, I would recommend wearing it for not longer than a day before you wash it, and you should change it out when it gets wet. One of the things that I'm concerned about is if you're wearing a face covering, especially if it's wet, you could actually be increasing your exposure to other agents in the environment. There could be bacteria that grows on your wet mask. So you could actually be creating a bit of a more hazardous environment for yourself. If you're using a disposable mask, such as one of the surgical masks, again, you would want to change it when it's wet. You probably wouldn't want to use it for more than one day. You'd have to be very careful with your handling of that mask to make sure that as you're putting it on and off, if you're using it more than once, that you're not contaminating yourself or your mask. So preference would be to obviously throw them away after one use. But if you can't, then you want to make sure that you're putting it in a paper bag if you're going to be reusing it after. If you're going to be washing it with the cloth masks, you can put them into a Ziploc bag. For the N95s, that's a little bit more tricky. They have a use life of approximately 8 to 12 hours. Right now, if you're using an N95, you could probably, depending on the situation that you're using it in and what you're using it for, would depend on how long you could use it. You still don't want to use it if it's wet. If it gets soiled, it should be thrown away. And if it gets contaminated from whatever your occupational exposure is, then you should also replace that mask at that time as well.
Okay. So back to the, the reuse of the surgical mask. So what I think I'm hearing is it's okay to use that surgical mask for the course of a day, and then, get a new one the next day. Is that consistent with how you feel?
I think given the circumstances, that's probably an ideal situation. The perfect ideal situation would be to throw it away and get a new one every time. Given the current situation, I think extending its use for a day is reasonable. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I'd start worrying more about different types of contamination issues. But understanding that some people have limitations at the moment.
So when we're looking at people wearing masks, people are really trying to distinguish, some of the questions that are coming in, if they're in open, desk space area, or if they can maintain 6 feet of distance, do they still keep their mask on? And the same thing in the lab space. So, do they have to continue to wear the mask if they're safely able to socially distance for 6 feet?
Another good question. So if you are in one of the municipalities that is requiring mask use in public space, you have to keep that mask on. If you are not in one of those municipalities, I would encourage you to handle your mask as little as possible. So even though you might be able to socially distance, and remember, when you're wearing a mask, it doesn't remove the requirement to socially distance. So just because you put that mask on doesn't mean you can get closer than 6 feet to people, unless you absolutely have to, obviously. The mask does not give you protection from that. So I would encourage people to still wear it at their desks as much as possible, and not to be putting it on and taking it off, because those are potential contamination points for you.
Mhm. So a couple questions have come up in regards to the storage, and maybe you could clarify what you just mentioned about storing the masks and storing a surgical mask versus a cloth mask, and should it be a plastic bag or a paper bag, and the reasons for if there's a difference.
Okay, so if you are taking a mask off and you're going to use it again later, you want to put it in a paper bag. And the reason for that is it will protect the bag, but it will also allow some breathability so that that mask doesn't just sit there and stay wet inside the bag. So that's why paper bags are recommended. If you have a cloth mask and you're done with it and it's ready to be washed, that's when you put it in a Ziploc bag, because then it's protected from the environment. You don't care if it's still wet because you're going to go wash that mask afterwards. So that would be the difference.
So could you speak more to washing those, the protocol, as it would be to wash and clean those cloth masks?
Sure. Actually, as part of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to properly take it off and put it on. So if you have your cloth mask, you want to grab it by the ear loops and not handle the cloth as much as possible. Cover your mouth and your nose and put it over your ears. Don't touch the mask as much as possible. And then I don't know if you guys can hear me when I put it on, but as I was saying, when you're wearing it, try not to touch the mask as much as possible. Just leave it alone. When you take it off, also take it off by the ear loops and then drop it into your bag. And then make sure you wash your hands with either hand sanitizer or soap and water right after you take the mask off, as well as right before you put the mask on. Now, to properly clean your cloth mask, there's 2 different ways you can do it. You can wash it in your washing machine on hot water, and then you can dry it in your dryer on the hottest setting. It's very important that the mask gets dried. The other thing you can do is I've seen some guidance saying that you can hand wash your masks if you don't want to do a full setting, a full laundry cycle. And then you can hang them outside to dry. Again, making sure that they dry completely is really the biggest issue.
Okay, great. So there's been several questions about using masks in the lab. So maybe you could speak to, lab use of masks versus using them in the office. If it's okay to wear a cloth mask in BL2 setting, for example. And lastly, if they should be considered, if there's any reason to consider them as medical waste when you're disposing of a disposable face mask.
Some good questions there too. So in the laboratory, it depends a little bit on the work that you're doing. I think if you're working in a low risk laboratory, wearing your cloth mask in there that you're also wearing in the office can be reasonable, because again, we're trying to limit the amount of times that we touch our face and touch our mask and put it on and off. However, if you're working with something higher risk in the laboratory, maybe you have BL2 work that you're doing, for example, then it might be beneficial to either wear a disposable mask while you're in the laboratory space and a cloth mask while you're at the office space, or have 2 different cloth masks that you go back and forth. I think the preference is to have a single mask that you're wearing that you don't have to handle a lot. But it would depend a little bit on what exactly you're doing in the lab. In terms of laundering and disposing of face masks that have been worn in the lab, I would think of them similar to maybe if you're wearing a sweater or something in the lab. If you have a disposable one, you don't technically need to throw it away as medical waste, but if you have bio waste there, I think that would be fine. You could put it in a Ziploc bag and then throw it away in the trash, which I think would be very reasonable. For your cloth mask in the lab, again, just it's important to wash and change it when it gets wet. Did I touch all the points, Jen?
I think you did, yep. So when you're thinking about, a lot of it is you've spoke to the moisture in the mask and how to control that moisture. And so do you recommend storing a mask with any type of desiccant in the bag or a plastic bag?
That's an interesting thought. I don't really have any references on that. Yeah, I don't really have any thoughts on that, except that remember you're putting it up against your face after. So whatever you're using as a desiccant, you'd want to make sure that it couldn't, have like chemical irritation against your face, inhalation. I think right now that's probably, there is no recommendation for using a desiccant. And I can't off the top of my head think of one that might be appropriate, but that's something that I could look into. It's an interesting thought.
So a couple of people have asked some questions. I know you touched upon this earlier, in talking about the supply chain and getting masks from other countries. Can you speak a little bit about thoughts on the KN95 masks versus an N95 mask?
KN95, are those from, I'm not sure what the K would be. Are those maybe from, I think we got some equipment from South Korea. Would that be?
Yeah, maybe it was more of an international person. If you want to provide some more clarification on that, that would be helpful in the question. So are there alternatives to, clean and wash an N95 mask?
Not really. There are some places that are disinfecting masks and they're doing different techniques, and that is being allowed because healthcare workers right now are in such desperate need. The issue is there are very few cleaning methods that have been approved for temporary use by OSHA, and we don't really know if the cleaning of the mask degrades the filter material. It could degrade the elastic. It can affect the fit around the face. So it's really not preferred. I know there's a few things. I think vaporized hydrogen peroxide has been said to be okay. I know autoclaving is not okay. Dry baking is not okay. Masks should not be microwaved. But there are a few things that healthcare workers are using, but I would not recommend that to the general public simply because I think it's very tricky.
So several people are starting to, fashion their own masks, and given the supply chain and also given the just responsibility to keep those masks for healthcare workers. So many people have complimented you on your mask. So could you speak to, making your own cloth mask and what's the best material to use for that, for your mask?
Sure. So they recommend a high weave cotton currently for making masks with more than one ply. So this mask is just like a quilting cotton, which I think is currently the best material they're recommending to use. It's a double layer. It actually also has a little pocket, so you can put like a coffee filter or something in it if you want to. I found this pattern on the internet. I think it was Sarah Maker was the pattern that I used to make this. And again, the important piece is really just making sure that it's a fabric that you can clean, that you make it so that it fits over your nose and your mouth. There's all kinds of different patterns you can find online that seem to, people have different preferences for. This is the style that I personally like. Some people make them with ties. Some people make just a single one that doesn't have the pleat. But I would recommend quilting cotton currently for the best material.
So as As people are moving, within their space and maybe in a common multi-tenant building, maybe you could speak to, how the employees should be wearing their masks as far as when they go into these common areas outside of the suite or go to the restroom. What's your advice on that?
So again, in those municipalities that have an ordinance currently, all of those spaces are covered. In Cambridge specifically, even if you're out on the sidewalk or you're walking on the road, you're required to have a face covering. So that's required in those municipalities. Generally speaking, I would recommend definitely if you are leaving your suite space, if you are going to the bathroom is actually one of the places that I would consider most likely to have an exposure. So I would definitely wear it in there. Again, the masks are not necessarily protecting you, but you've got to think about the people that are going in and out. You're protecting those surfaces from having droplets land on those surfaces and then someone else touching it. You never know when you're going to pass by someone in a public space. So I would recommend wearing your mask in those spaces, definitely.
So, you talked on cleaning masks, and people that work in the lab have been trained to, you don't take lab things home, you keep them in the lab. So of course it's a behavior change for a lot of people to think about wearing masks in a different way. And I know you touched upon cleaning masks, but could you just reiterate a little bit about wearing masks in the lab and then taking them home? Where do you wash them? Is it okay to take them home? You've been, everyone again has been trained not to take your lab coat home to wash in your home washing machine, for example. So, now they're going to be trained to, it's okay to take your mask home. So
yeah, these are exceptional times. I think that under normal circumstances, I would say no, right? But I think especially if you have a mask that you're wearing just in the laboratory, just keep a Ziploc taped to the wall outside of the lab. And then when you come out of the lab, you can doff that mask, put it right into your Ziploc bag, seal it up. And then I wash mine at home in my washing machine. The time I would not bring a mask home would be if you have an overt exposure. So any chemical, biological, you have a spill, I would not bring that mask home and wash it. I would throw that one away. If you're working with higher risk agents, I think there should be a little bit of thought about what is the risk here. And there will be some situations where you shouldn't bring your mask home, such as what I just mentioned, and other situations where the risk is fairly low. And because we're in this difficult time, we would bring it home and wash it when maybe normally we wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. So any thoughts on facial hair and wearing masks? I know certainly when you're when you're doing fit testing for respirators, it's prohibited, but what about now? What can
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I was just on a Zoom call with my cousin who has a full beard, and he was telling me how his company gave him N95s for protection. And I was like, well, unfortunately, so if you're wearing an N95 and you need it to be properly fit because you need that protection. So you are a healthcare worker who has direct contact with patients, or you need that N95 to protect you from something occupationally, you cannot have facial hair because you can't have anything with that seal. Again, this is not an N95, but it was the closest I could find. There's a sealing material around the inside on an actual N95, and that must seal directly to your skin. So you cannot have facial hair under those circumstances. For surgical masks and cloth masks, they're not tight fitting. They are not meant to protect you. They are meant to protect the people around you. And so if you have facial hair, I think that you can still wear your mask. You got to remember, you're not getting even somewhat of a seal. So you're not being protected, but the purpose of those masks isn't to protect you from the get-go. So I think having facial hair with those types of masks is okay.
So are face shields an alternative to wearing masks in the laboratory?
No. Face shields will not have any kind of snug fit. So the reason the masks help is because they are closer to your face and they can catch things right away. There's actually been a study where someone found that if you cut a piece of nylon stocking and put it around your face over your cloth mask or your surgical mask, that it increases the filtering efficiency and increases some of the protection for the wearer, and simply because it gives you a good seal to your face. So a face shield will, unfortunately, I think, not protect you from really any kind of aerosol, because there's just still all kinds of air movement around your face, getting to your mouth, getting to your nose. So unfortunately, I don't think face shields would be helpful.
So companies struggle with getting people to wear their safety glasses, and now that they've achieved good safety glass compliance, they're seeing a struggle with people, unable to wear their safety glasses because they fog up. So any helpful hints on that?
Yeah, so as you can tell, I'm wearing glasses now, and sometimes they fog up when I'm wearing a mask also. Basically what I do is I just kind of play around with them. You should have the mask underneath your face for best protection, but since it's not for your protection anyway, if you can sometimes put your glasses just under the mask edge, and that can help. There are some companies have special anti-fogging wipes at their safety glass stations that you can use that can be helpful. Yeah, those are my two best thoughts on that.
That's good, because we still want people to wear their safety glasses in the lab to protect their eyes.
And
And
wear your safety glasses, because remember, your eyes are an exposure route as well. So just anything extra to help you out.
So do you recommend that businesses start to purchase cloth masks for their workers?
I think if you're in a municipality that requires mask use, I think that is a good idea. If you want people to be coming into the office during this time when we have the stay-at-home order, I don't think that it falls under required PPE, but I do think it is a really good idea. It shows your employees that you care about them, that you're looking to provide a healthy environment. And something just as a side note, if someone does catch coronavirus at work, which is extremely difficult to prove, but if it does happen, it is an OSHA recordable incident. So showing that you've gone out of your way to protect your employees, I think, is an important step.
Do you know if you've, it'll be really interesting to hear about how people are going to distinguish, getting coronavirus at work versus not. I think we'll have to stay tuned for that a little bit.
Yeah. I think the contact tracing,
anti-fogging in the glasses.
mm-hmm.
Do you recommend using that? Like, there's some scuba diving, anti-fog, scuba diving, different things you can put on glasses. Would that work for the glasses in the lab?
I haven't tried it, but I think it would be worth a shot. If it works for scuba gear, I would assume it would also work for safety glasses.
Okay.
This is the time to be creative.
At the end of our questions here.
Perfect. We just have time for one more.
Yeah, so when we think about one, kind of last question, how do you deal with wearing masks and working in warm environments? People are moving around, leading to a hard time with breathing with those masks on. What can employers do to help with that compliance, but also make employees able to wear the masks and do their job?
Yeah, that is a difficult question, especially for people who are not used to wearing masks in general. It can be really difficult to breathe, especially if you're working in a hot environment like a mechanical area or someplace like that. I think looking at some of the OSHA heat stress regulations where they talk about, break times, making sure that the employees have access to water. I think the important piece would be just to make sure that they can take a break and maybe go outside, take the mask off for a few minutes. And also, I think important would be to make sure that employees are educated on when wearing that mask becomes dangerous for them, right? So if you're having trouble breathing, you might need to remove your